Have you ever felt like you're just going through the motions? Waking up, working, eating, sleeping, repeating the same cycle over and over again without questioning why? What if one day, you simply decided not to participate? What if you rejected the unwritten rules of society, not with rage, not with rebellion, but with silence? Today, we dive into one of the most haunting and thought-provoking stories ever written, Bartleby. The Scrivener by Herman Melville. A story that, despite being published in 1853, eerily mirrors the modern world in ways you wouldn't expect. It's about a man who doesn't fight, doesn't argue, and doesn't resist in the way we usually imagine. Instead, he quietly withdraws, refusing to conform to the expectations of work, social structure, and even survival itself. His only response? I would prefer not to. But what does that mean? And why does it send shivers down the spine of anyone who truly understands it? This isn't just a story, it's a warning. A reflection of how society treats those who don't fit the mold. A disturbing look at what happens when someone refuses to play their part in the machine. And maybe, just maybe, a reflection of you. Could you be Bartleby without realizing it? Are we all slowly turning into him? Stick with me until the end of this video as we uncover the dark side of work, capitalism, and the terrifying reality of quiet resistance. And before we start, if you enjoy deep, mind-blowing discussions like this, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss a video. If you want to support the channel, consider using the super thanks button below. Your donations help us create more content like this and keep the discussion alive. Now, let's unravel the mystery of Bartleby before it's too late. Herman Melville's Bartleby, The Scrivener, is a haunting exploration of human isolation, resistance, and the dehumanizing effects of capitalism. At its core, the story presents a man who simply refuses to engage with the system, challenging the expectations of productivity and conformity. Bartleby's quiet rebellion, expressed through his now iconic phrase, "I would prefer not to," has resonated for generations, making this work as relevant today as it was in the 19th century. Melville's own life mirrors the themes of alienation and struggle that he explores in his writing. Born into a well-off family that later fell into financial ruin, Melville experienced firsthand the instability of the American dream. His early successes, like Typee and Omoo, gained him recognition, but his later works, particularly Moby Dick and Bartleby, the Scrivener, were largely ignored during his lifetime. His deep, philosophical approach to storytelling was ahead of his time, and much like Bartleby, he was a man who did not conform to societal expectations, leading to his literary and financial downfall. In Bartleby, the Scrivener, Melville paints a bleak picture of Wall Street, a place driven by profit and efficiency, where human beings are reduced to mere cogs in the economic machine. The narrator, a well-established lawyer, prides himself on his practical and conflict-averse nature. He introduces us to a world where legal clerks, known as scriveners, are responsible for copying legal documents by hand, an arduous, repetitive task that highlights the mechanical nature of labor in capitalist society. Bartleby initially appears as an ideal employee, working diligently without complaint. However, when he is asked to proofread a document, he calmly responds, "I would prefer not to." This seemingly harmless phrase unsettles the lawyer, who struggles to understand Bartleby's refusal. At first, he rationalizes it as an act of misunderstanding or eccentricity. But as Bartleby continues to reject more tasks, his passive resistance becomes an existential challenge to the entire office. The lawyer's initial bemusement turns into frustration, then concern, and finally, helplessness. What makes Bartleby's resistance so powerful is its simplicity. He does not argue, explain, or rebel in a traditional sense. He simply withdraws. His quiet defiance exposes the absurdity of a system that demands unquestioning obedience. Unlike the lawyer's other employees, who may grumble but ultimately comply, Bartleby refuses to engage in the unwritten social contract of work. His noncompliance forces those around him to confront an uncomfortable truth. The workplace is not just a job but an expectation of participation in a system that values efficiency over humanity. Bartleby's refusal to conform extends beyond his work. It is later revealed that he lives in the office, sleeping on a worn-out couch and surviving on the most basic sustenance. This detail underscores his complete detachment from the outside world. He has no personal connections, no desires, no apparent ambitions, just an eerie, almost ghost-like presence that grows increasingly unsettling. His previous employment at the dead letter office in Washington, where undelivered messages are discarded, adds another layer of symbolism. The dead letter office serves as a metaphor for lost communication, forgotten lives, and the ultimate futility of human efforts in an indifferent system. This idea of silent resistance can be found in many facets of modern life. Consider the phenomenon of quiet quitting, where employees disengage from their work without formally resigning. They show up, do the bare minimum, and refuse to invest emotional energy into their roles. This mirrors Bartleby's passive resistance. He does not fight back in a traditional sense, but his refusal to participate fully in his assigned role disrupts the entire office dynamic. The modern workplace, much like the Wall Street office in Melville's story, often demands productivity at the expense of individuality and personal fulfillment. Employees who fail to conform to these expectations are either pushed out or fade into obscurity. Bartleby's fate is a tragic one, as his behavior becomes increasingly untenable. The lawyer, despite his initial sympathy, decides that the easiest course of action is to move his office and leave Bartleby behind. However, Bartleby remains in the abandoned space, refusing to leave even when confronted by the new tenants. Eventually, he is arrested for vagrancy and taken to a prison known as the Tombs, a name that serves as a grim foreshadowing of his ultimate demise. Even in prison, he refuses to eat, gradually wasting away. When the lawyer visits him, hoping to offer some comfort, he finds Bartleby dead, lying against a wall, his expression eerily serene. Melville leaves the reader with a chilling reflection. Ah, Bartleby. Ah, humanity. This closing lament encapsulates the story's deep existential sorrow. Bartleby is not just a single man who chose to disengage. He is a symbol of the countless individuals who, feeling alienated and powerless, withdraw from a world that does not recognize their humanity. The story critiques not only the economic system but also the broader social structures that leave no room for those who do not fit within conventional expectations. There are many real-world parallels to Bartleby's story. Consider how society treats those who refuse to conform, whether it be individuals experiencing homelessness, artists who reject commercial success, or workers who burn out and opt out of the grind. Those who step away from the expectations of productivity are often ignored, discarded, or institutionalized. The same capitalist machine that rewarded the lawyer for his practicality had no space for Bartleby's quiet defiance. Melville's critique extends beyond capitalism to human nature itself. The lawyer, despite his initial efforts to help Bartleby, ultimately chooses the path of least resistance. He moves on, just as society moves on from those who are no longer useful. This reflects a broader tendency to overlook or abandon those who struggle rather than addressing the deeper systemic issues that create such struggles in the first place. Another striking example can be found in the gig economy, where workers take on temporary, often low-paying jobs with little job security. Much like the Scriveners of Melville's Wall Street, gig workers are expected to perform repetitive tasks without questioning their role. Those who resist or demand better conditions are easily replaced, just as Bartleby is ultimately discarded. The rise of automation and AI-driven labor further exacerbates this issue, reducing workers to interchangeable parts in an ever-expanding economic machine. What makes Bartleby, the Scrivener, such a timeless piece of literature is its ability to make readers confront uncomfortable questions. What happens to those who cannot or will not conform? How does society justify its treatment of individuals who refuse to participate in its expectations? And, perhaps most hauntingly, how many of us are living like Bartleby, going through the motions? Disengaged, preferring not to challenge the structures that define our existence? Melville does not offer easy answers. Instead, he presents a stark, unsettling reality, one that forces readers to reckon with the cost of indifference and the quiet tragedies that unfold when humanity is sacrificed for efficiency. In the end, Bartleby's story is not just about one man's refusal to work. It is about the silent suffering of those who do not fit, the bureaucratic machine that erases them, and the society that chooses to look away. Herman Melville's life was one of paradoxes, filled with dramatic shifts that mirrored the themes of struggle and alienation in his works. Born in 1819 to a well-off merchant family in New York City, He experienced the comforts of wealth in his early years. However, this stability did not last. When his father's business failed and financial ruin struck, Melville's life took a drastic turn. The sudden shift from affluence to hardship had a profound effect on his worldview, shaping the dark, complex themes that would later define his writing. Forced to abandon his formal education, Melville took on various jobs, none of which provided the stability or intellectual satisfaction he craved. The most transformative period of his early life came when he became a sailor, embarking on whaling expeditions and voyages to the South Pacific. This experience exposed him to the vastness of the world, the brutality of life at sea, and the diverse cultures that existed beyond the confines of American society. He spent time among indigenous islanders, witnessed the exploitation of sailors, and developed a deep understanding of the struggles of men who lived outside conventional societal structures. Melville's early literary success was fueled by these experiences. His first novels, Typee 1846 and Omoo 1847, were adventure narratives based on his time in the Pacific. These works, filled with exotic settings and thrilling encounters, resonated with the public's fascination with exploration. They were commercially successful, establishing him as a promising young author. However, Melville was not content to simply entertain. As his writing matured, he sought to infuse his stories with deeper philosophical and existential themes. This shift in his approach, while artistically significant, marked the beginning of his alienation from mainstream literary audiences. His most ambitious work, Moby Dick, 1851, was a turning point. What he had envisioned as his masterpiece, a novel that combined adventure, metaphysical questions, and a deep critique of human obsession, was met with confusion and indifference. The book's dense symbolism, experimental structure, and philosophical depth alienated readers who had expected another straightforward adventure novel. Moby Dick was a commercial failure, leaving Melville disillusioned and financially strained. The rejection of his greatest work was a devastating blow, forcing him to shift away from writing novels and focus instead on poetry and short fiction. Melville's later works, including Bartleby, the Scrivener 1853, reflected his growing disillusionment with society. These stories abandoned the sweeping adventure narratives of his earlier career, instead delving into themes of alienation, the dehumanization of labor, and the quiet resistance of those who refused to conform. Bartleby in particular was a striking departure, presenting a character who simply withdraws from the expectations of work and society, echoing Melville's own sense of being out of place in the literary world. Despite his brilliance, Melville was largely forgotten by the time of his death in 1891. His later works failed to gain the recognition he had once enjoyed, and he lived out his final years working as a customs inspector, a mundane job that stood in stark contrast to the grandeur of his literary imagination. He died in relative obscurity, his books gathering dust on shelves, dismissed by a literary establishment that had moved on to other voices. It was not until decades later that Melville's genius was rediscovered. The 20th century modernist movement, with its embrace of complex narratives and existential questions, brought new attention to his work. Critics and scholars began to recognize the brilliance of Moby Dick, elevating it to the status of one of the greatest American novels ever written. Bartleby, the Scrivener, once overlooked, became a touchstone for discussions on alienation, passive resistance, and the impact of industrial capitalism on the human soul. Melville's reputation underwent a complete reversal, transforming him from a forgotten writer into a literary giant. His posthumous recognition places him in the company of other artists who were ahead of their time. Vincent van Gogh, another figure who died in obscurity, only gained widespread acclaim after his death. Like Melville, Van Gogh was misunderstood during his lifetime, his innovative techniques and emotional intensity failing to resonate with contemporary audiences. Both men struggled with a world that did not yet appreciate their genius, only to be celebrated long after their passing. Melville's story is a reminder of the unpredictable nature of artistic legacy. His life was marked by failure and frustration, yet his ideas endured, waiting for a time when the world was ready to understand them. Today, his work is studied, analyzed, and revered, proving that true genius is often recognized only in retrospect. His struggles, much like those of his characters, reflect the broader existential dilemmas of human existence, what it means to be misunderstood, to resist conformity, and to seek meaning in a world that does not always provide it. Bartleby's presence in the lawyer's office begins unremarkably, with his quiet demeanor and diligent work making him appear as just another Scrivener, a mere cog in the bureaucratic machine of Wall Street. At first, he copies legal documents with great dedication, but when the lawyer asks him to review a paper, he responds with a phrase that will define him: "I would prefer not to." This seemingly polite yet firm refusal is neither aggressive nor apologetic, it is simply a quiet rejection of expectation. His employer is taken aback but does not immediately force the issue. Instead, curiosity and confusion grow as Bartleby continues to resist further tasks, repeating his passive refusal without any explanation or emotion. His words are neither a negotiation nor an argument, they are a simple yet impenetrable wall against authority. As the story unfolds, Bartleby's passive resistance deepens. He stops working entirely, refusing even to leave the office. As if detaching himself from the world outside, his presence becomes increasingly unsettling, not because he is overtly defiant but because his quiet refusal exposes the absurdity of the rigid, dehumanized work environment. The lawyer, initially perplexed, begins to feel an odd mix of sympathy and helplessness. He offers Bartleby other jobs, even money to start anew elsewhere, but Bartleby declines them all with the same quiet resistance. His existence within the office becomes ghost-like. He is there, but he does not participate, a silent figure who disrupts the normal flow of productivity simply by not engaging with it. Bartleby's behavior is not an act of rebellion in the traditional sense. He does not organize protests, incite others, or articulate any political stance. Instead, he embodies a passive resistance so pure that it cannot be reasoned with, which makes it all the more unsettling. His refusal to work is also a refusal to explain himself, a rejection not just of the tasks assigned to him but of the entire system that assigns them. The lawyer, bound by his own sense of propriety and the expectations of capitalism, is left with no framework to process Bartleby's noncompliance. There is no confrontation, no argument to win, only an employee who simply will not participate in the mechanisms of production. This silent rebellion forces those around Bartleby to confront uncomfortable truths. The other clerks, Turkey and Nippers, react with frustration and ridicule, unable to comprehend a person who does not conform to the work culture. The lawyer, despite his growing concern for Bartleby, ultimately chooses the path of least resistance. He moves his office elsewhere rather than dealing with the discomfort of Bartleby's presence. Society, in turn, has no space for someone like Bartleby. When he refuses to vacate the old office, the new tenants have him arrested for vagrancy, leading to his ultimate demise in prison. In his final days, he refuses even to eat, a final act of withdrawal from a world that has no place for him. Bartleby's passive resistance has become increasingly relevant in today's world. His refusal to participate mirrors modern workplace trends like quiet quitting, where employees disengage from their jobs without formally resigning. Instead of outright defiance, many workers today simply choose not to go beyond the bare minimum, rejecting hustle culture and prioritizing personal well-being over corporate expectations. The reasons behind this movement vary: burnout, disillusionment, or a recognition that excessive effort often goes unrewarded, but the result is a workforce that, much like Bartleby, is silently opting out of the system rather than openly challenging it. The rise of remote work and changing attitudes toward employment have further exacerbated this trend. Many workers now find themselves detached from traditional office structures, performing their duties in isolation and questioning the value of their labor. In the past, people sought purpose and identity in their careers, but today, a growing number of employees see work as a necessary burden rather than a source of fulfillment. This shift in perspective aligns closely with Bartleby's quiet defiance and implicit rejection of the idea that one's worth is tied to their productivity. Bartleby also serves as a metaphor for the broader issue of alienation in modern society. Just as he withdraws from work and human connection, many individuals today find themselves increasingly isolated despite being more digitally connected than ever. Social media, while offering endless interaction, often fails to provide genuine connection. Many experience a sense of detachment, similar to Bartleby's presence in the office physically there, but emotionally and mentally disconnected. The rise of mental health awareness has brought more attention to workplace stress and burnout. Yet many companies continue to operate under systems that prioritize efficiency over humanity. Just as the lawyer and his firm expected unwavering compliance from Bartleby, the corporate world's response to figures like Bartleby is strikingly similar to how modern companies address disengaged employees. Rather than examining the deeper issues at play, such as workplace culture or systemic burnout, businesses often resort to quick fixes, offering small incentives, implementing wellness programs, or in some cases, quietly pushing out those who do not fit the mold. Just as the lawyer chose to relocate his office rather than confront Bartleby's defiance head-on, companies today may choose to restructure, automate roles, or replace disengaged workers rather than address the fundamental dissatisfaction driving the disengagement. Bartleby's ultimate fate, dying alone in prison, underscores the harsh reality of what happens to those who do not conform. Society, both in Melville's time and today, struggles to accommodate those who reject its expectations. Those who withdraw from work, whether due to mental health struggles, disillusionment, or a simple desire for something more meaningful, often find themselves excluded, left behind by a world that values participation over existence. Bartleby's death is not just a personal tragedy, it is an indictment of a system that sees nonconformity as something to be erased rather than understood. This raises an unsettling question. How many people today are living like Bartleby? How many are trapped in jobs they do not find fulfilling, silently withdrawing rather than rebelling outright? And how does society react to them? Do we, like the lawyer, feel a fleeting sense of sympathy before moving on? Or do we challenge the structures that create so many Bartlebys in the first place? The beauty and tragedy of Bartleby. The Scrivener lie in its refusal to provide easy answers. Melville does not frame Bartleby as a hero or villain, he is simply a man who prefers not to participate. And in doing so, reveals the absurdity of the world around him. His story continues to resonate because it speaks to a fundamental human dilemma. What happens when we no longer wish to play by the rules, yet have nowhere else to go? The office where Bartleby works is a sterile, monotonous environment, a perfect symbol of the soulless nature of capitalism. The lawyer who narrates the story describes it as a place where legal documents are copied endlessly, where each Scrivener is expected to produce work with mechanical precision. The walls of the office enclose the workers, both literally and metaphorically, trapping them in a cycle of repetitive labor with no room for creativity or personal expression. The physical setting reinforces the sense of confinement. The view from Bartleby's desk is nothing but a blank wall, reflecting the limited scope of his existence. The work performed in this space is impersonal, devoid of meaning beyond its immediate function, and those who inhabit it are reduced to nothing more than tools for economic production. Bartleby's decline highlights the psychological toll of such an environment. Initially productive, he soon becomes disengaged, his soul seemingly eroded by the mind-numbing routine of copying documents. His refusal to work is not an act of defiance in the traditional sense, it is a passive withdrawal, as though his very being can no longer tolerate the inhumanity of his role. The more he resists, the more his existence becomes unbearable, not just for himself, but for those around him. The lawyer, who prides himself on being reasonable and pragmatic, struggles to understand Bartleby's behavior because it challenges the fundamental assumptions of the capitalist system. If work is the primary measure of a person's worth, then what does it mean when someone refuses to participate? The dehumanization of work under capitalism is not limited to fiction. The modern workplace, particularly in corporate settings, often mirrors the lifeless, rigid structure of Bartleby's office. In companies like Amazon, where workers are constantly monitored, timed, and expected to meet relentless quotas, the idea of individuality becomes secondary to productivity. Employees in warehouses are treated as interchangeable units of labor, their efficiency tracked through algorithms, with little regard for their well-being. The demands of the job can be so intense that workers have reported skipping bathroom breaks to avoid missing targets. And stories of physical exhaustion, stress, and injury are common. The experience of these workers is not far removed from Bartleby's existence, trapped in an environment where their humanity is systematically stripped away. Beyond warehouses, even white-collar jobs reflect the same dehumanization in subtler ways. Many corporate employees find themselves trapped in a cycle of meaningless meetings, endless emails, and performance evaluations that measure their worth in terms of metrics and output rather than creativity or personal fulfillment. The phenomenon of burnout has become increasingly prevalent, with workers feeling emotionally and physically drained by the relentless demands of productivity. The pressure to perform, to always be available, and to constantly prove one's value in a competitive marketplace has led to a crisis in mental health. In many cases, employees who struggle with the demands of work are not supported but are instead seen as liabilities. Like Bartleby, those who do not conform are pushed aside, either forced out or left to wither in roles that offer no meaning. The impersonal nature of modern capitalism also manifests in the growing dependence on automation and artificial intelligence. Just as Bartleby's role as a scrivener was eventually made obsolete by advances in printing technology, many workers today face the looming threat of being replaced by machines. Algorithms now perform tasks that once required human input, from customer service to financial analysis. This shift not only eliminates jobs but also further reduces the sense of human connection in the workplace. Employees are increasingly treated as temporary placeholders, valued only for their immediate utility. When they are no longer needed, they are discarded, much like Bartleby was abandoned when he ceased to be productive. The emotional detachment fostered by capitalist work culture is evident in how businesses handle disengaged employees. Instead of addressing systemic issues like overwork, low pay, or lack of fulfillment, companies often resort to superficial solutions, wellness programs, mindfulness apps, or corporate slogans that promote resilience without actually improving working conditions. The lawyer in Bartleby, the scrivener, similarly attempts to deal with Bartleby's withdrawal by offering money or suggesting new opportunities, without ever truly understanding the root of his disengagement. His failure to connect with Bartleby on a deeper level mirrors how modern workplaces treat struggling employees not with empathy, but with transactional offers that do nothing to address the underlying problem. The commodification of human labor under capitalism also leads to a culture where people are expected to sacrifice their personal lives for their jobs. The rise of hustle culture glorifies overwork, suggesting that success is only attainable through constant effort and self-sacrifice. Workers are encouraged to equate their identities with their jobs, making it even more devastating when they experience burnout or job loss. This culture reinforces the idea that people exist primarily to produce, reducing their value to their economic contributions. In this sense, Bartleby's silent rebellion, his refusal to continue working, becomes a radical act. By choosing inaction, he rejects the system that defines people solely by their productivity. Perhaps the most chilling aspect of Bartleby's story is how quickly he is forgotten. Once he is removed from the office, life goes on as if he never existed. The lawyer experiences fleeting guilt, but ultimately, Bartleby becomes just another lost figure, another casualty of a system that does not make space for those who cannot or will not comply. This reflects the real-world fate of many workers who burn out or fall through the cracks. Those who leave jobs due to exhaustion or disillusionment are often replaced without a second thought, their struggles erased by the relentless march of progress. The system continues to function, indifferent to the individuals it discards. Bartleby's experience is a reminder that work, in its most dehumanized form, strips people of their identity and autonomy, whether in a 19th century law office or a modern corporate environment. The expectation to conform, to produce, and to function without question remains the same. His quiet refusal forces us to consider the true cost of a system that prioritizes efficiency over humanity. In a world where people are increasingly viewed as expendable, Bartleby's fate is not just a cautionary tale, it is a reflection of reality. At first, Bartleby is a curiosity. The lawyer who hires him sees him as a quiet, efficient scrivener, someone who does not cause trouble and simply does his work. When Bartleby begins refusing to complete certain tasks with his now famous response, "I would prefer not to," the lawyer's initial reaction is one of confusion. He tries to reason with Bartleby, assuming that this strange behavior is temporary or that Bartleby might simply need encouragement. The other employees in the office, Turkey and Nippers, react differently, one with irritation, the other with amusement. They mock Bartleby, but they do not see him as a threat. At this stage, he is an anomaly, but not yet a problem. As time goes on, however, Bartleby's refusals become more pronounced. He stops working altogether, yet he does not leave. He simply exists in the office, refusing all requests, rejecting all attempts to help or persuade him. This change forces those around him to reconsider their initial perceptions. The lawyer, though still puzzled, begins to feel a strange sense of responsibility for Bartleby. He offers him money, suggests alternative jobs, and even invites him to stay in his own home for a time. But when Bartleby refuses every offer, the lawyer's patience wears thin. His curiosity turns into frustration, and then into a quiet kind of fear. The mere presence of Bartleby, someone who does not conform, who does not follow the unwritten rules of work and society, becomes unsettling. Eventually, the lawyer, rather than confronting Bartleby or seeking a deeper understanding, chooses the simplest solution. He moves his office elsewhere, leaving Bartleby behind. This pattern reflects a larger societal truth. People who do not conform are often first met with curiosity. They may be tolerated for a while, even admired for their uniqueness. But when they refuse to integrate, society turns against them. The default reaction is not to understand but to distance. Those who fail to follow the script, who step outside the boundaries of normal expectations, are gradually pushed to the margins. They are ignored, dismissed, or in extreme cases, actively punished. The treatment of Bartleby is not an isolated incident. It is the way human societies have always dealt with those who refuse to play by the rules. History is filled with examples of brilliant individuals who were ostracized because they did not fit within their time. Nikola Tesla, one of the greatest inventors in history, spent his later years in obscurity and poverty despite his groundbreaking contributions to science. His unconventional thinking and inability to conform to the business-driven world of Thomas Edison and J.P. Morgan led to his decline. He was not interested in profit, nor in securing power and influence. He simply pursued knowledge. And because of that, he was left behind. His ideas, once dismissed, only gained recognition decades later. Like Bartleby, Tesla did not fight back against those who ignored him. He simply faded into the background, forgotten by the very society that had once celebrated his genius. Other figures share a similar fate. Vincent van Gogh, who created some of the most revered paintings in history, died in poverty and obscurity. His work, unappreciated in his time, only gained recognition after his death. His struggles with mental health, his inability to function within the rigid structures of the art world, and his overall nonconformity made him an outcast. Society, as it often does, only embraced his work when he was no longer around to benefit from it. The pattern of rejecting the nonconformist extends beyond individuals to entire groups of people. Throughout history, movements that challenged mainstream ideas were often met with hostility before eventually being accepted. The suffragettes, who fought for women's rights in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, were ridiculed, arrested, and even physically assaulted for demanding the right to vote. Today, their cause is seen as an obvious moral victory, but at the time, they were labeled as troublemakers who refused to accept their place in society. The civil rights movement faced the same pattern. Martin Luther King Jr., now universally revered, was seen as a radical threat in his time. He was surveilled by the FBI, attacked by politicians, and ultimately assassinated for refusing to conform to a system of racial segregation. Bartleby's rejection of social expectations follows this historical pattern. He does not explicitly challenge anyone, does not argue or protest. He simply stops participating. And because he does not provide a clear reason, does not engage in the expected back and forth of argument and debate, those around him do not know what to do with him. His quiet noncompliance is more unsettling than active resistance because it cannot be reasoned with. He becomes an outlier, a disruption to the structured world of Wall Street, and for that, he must be removed. Modern society still struggles with the treatment of those who do not conform. In corporate environments, employees who do not engage in office culture, who do not show enthusiasm for the company's mission, or who refuse to work long hours for little reward are often seen as problems. The rise of quiet quitting, where employees only do what is required of them and nothing more, has been met with backlash from employers who expect unwavering dedication. Like Bartleby, these workers are not actively rebelling. They are simply refusing to engage beyond what is necessary. And yet, They are treated as if they are doing something wrong. Outside of the workplace, the treatment of neurodivergent individuals reflects a similar trend. People with conditions like autism, ADHD, or severe anxiety often struggle to fit into societal expectations of behavior. They may have difficulty with social norms, may not conform to traditional work environments, or may express themselves in ways that others find unusual. Rather than being accommodated, they are often isolated, pushed aside, or expected to change in order to fit in. The expectation is not that society should adapt to include them, but that they must adapt to fit into society. Even in the realm of education, students who do not conform to standard learning models are often penalized. Those who struggle with rigid classroom structures, who think differently, or who do not excel within the traditional grading system are often dismissed as lazy or unmotivated. The system is not designed to nurture individuality, it is designed to reward those who conform to its rules. Bartleby's quiet refusal to engage in his prescribed role reflects the reality of many people who simply cannot or will not force themselves into a system that does not accommodate them. The lawyer's final act, moving his office and leaving Bartleby behind, is a metaphor for how society deals with nonconformists. Rather than attempting to truly understand or integrate them, it simply moves on, leaving them in the margins. Bartleby, like so many before and after him, is abandoned, not because he is violent or disruptive, but because he refuses to play by the rules. His fate, dying alone in prison after refusing to eat, is a grim reflection of what happens to those who do not fit within society's expectations. Whether through literal abandonment or social exclusion, nonconformists are often left to fend for themselves in a world that has little patience for those who do not align with its norms. The tragedy of Bartleby is that he is not a villain, nor a hero. He is simply a man who does not belong in the system that governs his world. His quiet resistance is a statement, not of defiance, but of detachment, and his ultimate fate serves as a warning about the dangers of a society that cannot tolerate those who choose to step outside of its expectations. His story continues to resonate because the struggle of the nonconformist is as relevant today as it was in Melville's time. Whether in workplaces, schools, or broader social structures, the question remains: what happens to those who, like Bartleby, simply prefer not to participate? Bartleby's past is revealed near the end of the story, almost as an afterthought, yet it adds a deeply symbolic layer to his character. Before arriving at the lawyer's office, Bartleby worked at the dead letter office in Washington, a place where undelivered mail was sorted and eventually discarded. These letters never reaching their intended recipients are a haunting metaphor for lost communication, unfulfilled connections, and ultimately, forgotten lives. The dead letter office is not just a setting, it represents an existential void. A place where messages meant to bring people together instead end up discarded. Their contents never known, their intended impact erased. Bartleby, having spent time in such a place, seems to embody the same fate: isolated, unread, lost to a system that does not recognize his existence. The idea of dead letters carries immense weight. These letters may contain words of love that never reach their destination, final goodbyes that go unread, or urgent pleas for help that remain unanswered. They represent a breakdown in communication, a failure of human connection. It is not difficult to see why working in such an environment would leave an impact on someone like Bartleby, who already seems detached from the world. He spent his days handling messages that would never be received, and in doing so, he became like the letters themselves, cast aside, unclaimed, and without a home. His later behavior in the office, his quiet withdrawal from society, can be seen as an extension of this experience. If the very words people send to each other can be so easily discarded, what does that say about the value of human expression? If communication itself can be erased, then what is the purpose of participation? Bartleby's role in the dead letter office aligns with the broader theme of society discarding those who do not fit its mold. Just as the letters are deemed irrelevant and destroyed, so too are individuals who cannot or do not conform to societal expectations. This is seen in the way people who struggle with mental illness, poverty, or other challenges are often pushed to the margins, ignored, and forgotten. The modern equivalent of the dead letter office exists in the way cities treat their most vulnerable citizens, particularly the homeless population, who are often rendered invisible by a society that chooses not to see them. In major cities around the world, countless individuals live on the streets, surviving day by day in conditions most people prefer to ignore. Like dead letters, they exist in plain sight, yet they are rarely acknowledged. Commuters walk past them without making eye contact. Businesses install hostile architecture to prevent them from resting in public spaces. And policymakers implement laws that criminalize their existence rather than offering real solutions. The system treats them as a problem to be erased rather than as human beings in need of compassion. Bartleby's fate mirrors this reality. He is not actively harmed but is instead neglected, left to deteriorate in a world that has no place for him. The concept of being lost in the system extends beyond the homeless population. Many elderly individuals, particularly those without family, experience a similar kind of erasure. Placed in nursing homes or assisted living facilities, they often find themselves cut off from meaningful social interaction, despite having lived full lives, contributing to society in countless ways. They become invisible as they age, their voices unheard, their experiences forgotten. Like Bartleby and the dead letters he once handled, they become remnants of a life that no longer seems relevant to the fast-moving world around them. Even within corporate environments, employees can experience a kind of symbolic death, particularly when they are laid off or forced into early retirement. Workers who have dedicated decades to a company can find themselves abruptly dismissed, their years of service reduced to a severance package and a brief farewell email. Once they leave, the workplace moves on without them, just as society moved on from Bartleby. The shift from being an active participant in an organization to being discarded reflects the same existential reality. People are valued only for their immediate utility. And once they are no longer deemed necessary, they are forgotten. The dead letter office also serves as a commentary on bureaucracy and the impersonal nature of large institutions. In the same way that government agencies, corporations, and social services often fail to truly address human needs, the dead letter office functions as a symbol of systematic inefficiency. Letters, which should represent connection, emotion, and urgency, are instead reduced to meaningless objects, processed mechanically until they are destroyed. This reflects how many institutions, rather than helping those in need, simply manage them, filing paperwork, enforcing rules, and ultimately discarding those who do not fit within predefined categories. Bartleby's inability to re-engage with society after his time at the dead letter office suggests that he internalized this message of disposability. He no longer sees the point in participating in a system that so easily discards people. His passive resistance, his preference not to work, not to leave, not to eat, becomes an extension of his belief that his existence, like the letters he once handled, is ultimately meaningless. His demise in prison, where he simply fades away, reinforces the idea that society does not accommodate those who step outside its expectations. There is no dramatic conclusion, no act of redemption, only silence, as another forgotten individual disappears from view. The tragedy of Bartleby and the dead letter office is that it remains deeply relevant today. In an era of increasing digital communication, ghosting, where people simply disappear from conversations without explanation, has become a common phenomenon. Just like dead letters, these unanswered messages represent an abrupt severance of connection. Whether in friendships, relationships, or professional settings, being ignored or abandoned without closure leaves a lasting impact, reinforcing the sense of isolation that Bartleby experienced. The more technology advances, the easier it becomes to disconnect, to leave messages unread, to treat people as disposable. This detachment from human interaction mirrors the cold efficiency of the dead letter office, where words, no matter how important, are ultimately discarded. The deeper lesson of the dead letter office is that when communication fails, when society neglects those who do not conform, when people are treated as disposable, the result is profound loneliness. Bartleby's story is not just about one man, it is about the countless individuals who, for one reason or another, are left behind. Whether they are the homeless ignored on city streets, the elderly forgotten in care homes, the workers discarded after years of service, or simply individuals who experience the quiet erasure of being ghosted in a world that moves too fast to acknowledge them. The fate of the lost is one that continues to haunt us. Bartleby's past at the dead letter office is not just a detail in the story, it is the key to understanding him. He is not just a man who refuses to work, He is a man who has seen firsthand how easily people and their words can be discarded. His withdrawal from life is not laziness or stubbornness, it is the result of a deep disillusionment with a world that does not seem to value human connection. In his quiet refusal, he forces us to confront the question: what happens when people become like dead letters, unread, unclaimed, and ultimately forgotten? Bartleby's form of resistance is unlike traditional acts of defiance. He does not shout, argue, or actively rebel. Instead, he quietly refuses to participate. His passive resistance encapsulated in the simple phrase, "I would prefer not to." This refusal, though not outwardly aggressive, is deeply unsettling because it disrupts the expected order without providing justification or an alternative solution. Unlike revolutionaries who seek to overthrow systems, Bartleby simply disengages, allowing his existence to serve as a critique of the world around him. His silence and refusal to work make him an anomaly in a society that equates productivity with purpose. The power of passive resistance lies in its ability to expose the absurdity of the system by refusing to acknowledge it. Throughout history, passive resistance has been a powerful tool for social and political change. Mahatma Gandhi's strategy of nonviolent resistance against British colonial rule in India is one of the most well-known examples. Gandhi understood that direct violence against a superior force would only lead to more oppression. Instead, he encouraged Indians to resist the British economically by refusing to buy British goods, withdrawing from government jobs, and boycotting foreign institutions. His approach was not one of direct confrontation but of systematic disengagement. The Salt March of 1930, where Gandhi and his followers walked 240 miles to the Arabian Sea to produce their own salt in defiance of British salt laws, was a symbolic act of non-compliance. Much like Bartleby, Gandhi's refusal to play by the system's rules demonstrated that the system only functioned if people agreed to participate. The British, unable to force compliance without appearing tyrannical, struggled to counter his movement without resorting to extreme violence, which only fueled further dissent. Similarly, Martin Luther King Jr. used passive resistance as a strategy to fight racial segregation in the United States. The Montgomery bus boycott, inspired by Rosa Parks' refusal to give up her seat to a white passenger, was an act of economic non-cooperation that lasted over a year. Black citizens, rather than engaging in violent uprisings, simply refused to use the city's public transportation, crippling the system financially. Sit-ins at segregated lunch counters followed the same principle. African American students would sit in whites-only sections and refuse to leave. Their mere presence was an act of defiance. Yet they did not fight back when met with hostility. Like Bartleby, they did not attack the system, they simply rejected its legitimacy. However, there is a crucial difference between Bartleby's passive resistance and that of Gandhi or King. While both historical figures used nonviolent resistance to demand change, Bartleby's defiance is not aimed at improving society. Instead, it is a personal withdrawal, a rejection of participation without an attempt to alter the system itself. His inaction is a refusal rather than a reformist movement. This raises the question of whether passive resistance is only powerful when it is tied to a larger purpose. Gandhi and King mobilized collective action, using their personal resistance as an inspiration for others. Bartleby, in contrast, isolates himself. He does not attempt to rally others to his cause, nor does he articulate what he stands for. His defiance, therefore, does not lead to reform but to his own demise. This contrast highlights an important distinction between different forms of resistance. Active resistance, whether violent or nonviolent, seeks to challenge and ultimately dismantle unjust systems. Passive resistance, in its purest form, may expose flaws in the system but does not necessarily lead to structural change. Bartleby's story demonstrates the risks of absolute passivity while his actions reveal the rigidity of capitalist labor structures. They do not inspire others to take action. Instead, he becomes an isolated figure, ignored and eventually discarded by the system he refuses to engage with. This is the fate of many who choose silent withdrawal over active protest. Yet, Bartleby's refusal also forces those around him to confront uncomfortable truths. The lawyer, despite his initial attempts to help, ultimately abandons him because he does not know how to handle someone who simply opts out of the system. This reflects how society often responds to those who do not conform rather than addressing their concerns or questioning the structures that exclude them. It marginalizes them further. This happens not only to individuals but also to entire communities. Indigenous groups who refuse to assimilate into Western economic and cultural systems, for example, are often ignored rather than engaged with. Their resistance, though not always outwardly aggressive, challenges the assumption that participation in the dominant system is the only path forward. In the modern world, passive resistance takes many forms, some more effective than others. The rise of digital activism has allowed people to protest by withdrawing their support from companies or institutions that engage in unethical practices. Boycotts and social media campaigns function similarly to Gandhi's economic resistance, using collective disengagement as a tool for change. However, individual acts of withdrawal such as quitting a job without confronting workplace injustices often result in personal relief without systemic impact. Bartleby's fate serves as a cautionary tale for those who disengage without a broader strategy. Without collective action, passive resistance risks becoming mere self-erasure. There are also instances where passive resistance is used to highlight personal struggles rather than systemic ones. The phenomenon of quiet quitting, where employees do only the bare minimum required of them rather than striving for promotions or recognition, mirrors Bartleby's refusal to work. Workers who feel undervalued or overworked may not openly protest, but they disengage, refusing to give more than is contractually necessary. While this can be an act of self-preservation, it also exposes the inefficiencies of workplace cultures that demand constant enthusiasm and unpaid effort. However, like Bartleby, quiet quitting does not necessarily lead to reform. Employers may simply replace disengaged workers rather than address the underlying issues that cause dissatisfaction. The effectiveness of passive resistance ultimately depends on whether it is an individual act of defiance or a collective movement. When individuals silently withdraw without connecting to a larger cause, they risk fading into obscurity, much like Bartleby did. But when passive resistance is harnessed as a strategy for change, it can shake the foundations of unjust systems. The key difference between Bartleby and figures like Gandhi or King is intention. Bartleby resists simply because he prefers not to participate. Gandhi and King resisted with the goal of creating a better world. Yet, Bartleby's defiance remains powerful precisely because it is so difficult to categorize. His refusal to work is not an explicit demand for better conditions, nor is it a critique of capitalism in any conventional sense. It is simply an assertion of personal will against societal expectation. In this sense, he represents all those who feel alienated from modern life, those who see no place for themselves in the structures that govern society. Whether his resistance is seen as tragic or heroic depends on perspective. Does his refusal expose the system's flaws, or does it merely lead to his own destruction? Ultimately, Bartleby's story forces us to ask what happens to those who do not fit within the framework of work, productivity, and social participation. Is there space for passive resistance in a world that demands engagement? Can silent withdrawal ever be a path to change, or does it merely lead to erasure? His fate suggests that society does not know how to handle those who refuse to conform. Rather than being absorbed or understood, they are simply left behind. Whether this is an argument against passive resistance or a testament to its disruptive power is left for the reader to decide. Bartleby's story continues to resonate because the fundamental structures of work, society, and human isolation have not changed as much as we might like to think. While we live in a world with more technological advancements, more opportunities for connection, and a greater awareness of mental health, the underlying mechanisms that govern our daily lives remain eerily similar to those in Melville's time. People still find themselves trapped in jobs that feel meaningless, stuck in routines that drain their sense of identity, and isolated in a system that values productivity over individual well-being. Bartleby's quiet resistance, his passive refusal to participate in a system that does not recognize his humanity, forces us to ask whether we are any different from him. The modern workplace, despite its advancements, still carries the same rigid expectations that shaped Bartleby's world. The rise of corporate culture, the obsession with efficiency, and the relentless demand for output have created environments where employees often feel like cogs in a machine. Many people find themselves disengaged, doing the bare minimum to get by, much like Bartleby's refusal to review documents or even to leave the office. The phenomenon of quiet quitting reflects this reality: workers who do not actively resist but also do not invest themselves in their work beyond what is absolutely necessary. This silent withdrawal, though less dramatic than outright rebellion, is a clear signal that something is deeply wrong with the way society defines work and success. Beyond work, Bartleby's alienation mirrors the broader experience of loneliness in modern society. Despite being more connected than ever through social media, many people report feeling more isolated, more disconnected from real human relationships. The paradox of modern life is that we are surrounded by communication yet often feel unheard. The way Bartleby slowly fades into the background, ignored and forgotten by those around him, reflects the experience of countless individuals who struggle with loneliness, depression, and a sense of not belonging. His fate is not unique to the 19th century. It is the same fate faced by those who feel invisible in a world that prioritizes efficiency over empathy. The story also raises the question of how society treats those who refuse to conform. Bartleby does not fit into the system, and as a result, he is first tolerated, then resented, and finally discarded. This pattern is still evident today in how people who do not meet societal expectations, whether due to mental illness, neurodivergence, or simply a different outlook on life, are often pushed aside rather than accommodated. Homeless individuals, for example, are treated as nuisances rather than people in need of help. Those who struggle with traditional work structures are labeled as unmotivated rather than as individuals who might need different forms of support. The expectation remains the same: conform or be forgotten. Bartleby's fate also highlights the limits of sympathy. The lawyer, who initially tries to help Bartleby, ultimately gives up when faced with a situation he cannot fix. His response is not one of cruelty but of discomfort. He does not know what to do with someone who does not respond to conventional solutions. This is a reflection of how society often deals with those in crisis. Mental health awareness has grown, but the actual support systems in place are often inadequate. Many people find themselves abandoned, not because others wish to harm them, but because others do not know how to help. This passive neglect is just as harmful as active rejection. The question that Bartleby's story forces us to ask is whether we, as a society, have truly learned from his fate. Are we still living in a world where people are valued only for their productivity? Are we still allowing individuals to slip through the cracks simply because they do not fit into predefined roles? And, perhaps most unsettlingly, how many of us are living like Bartleby without realizing it, trapped in routines that feel meaningless? Quietly withdrawing from engagement, feeling disconnected from the world around us? The challenge is to recognize when we are becoming like Bartleby and to find ways to reclaim our sense of purpose before it is too late. This does not necessarily mean quitting our jobs or rejecting all societal norms. But it does mean asking whether the way we live aligns with what truly matters to us. It means questioning the structures that demand conformity without considering individual needs. It means finding ways to reconnect with our work, with each other, and with ourselves. The real tragedy of Bartleby is not just his death but the fact that no one truly understands him before he is gone. His silence is misinterpreted, his needs are ignored, and his humanity is overlooked. If his story teaches us anything, it is that we cannot afford to let this happen in our own lives or in the lives of those around us. In a world that often feels increasingly indifferent, the most radical act we can take may not be passive resistance, but active engagement, choosing to see, to understand, and to care, even when it is easier to look away. So, now that you know Bartleby's story, where do you stand? Are you caught in a cycle of endless work, just following orders, losing yourself in the process? Do you feel the weight of expectation, the demand for productivity, the pressure to conform? Or do you feel the urge to resist, to step back, to reclaim your humanity? Bartleby's tragic fate isn't just fiction. It's happening today, in corporate offices, in quiet apartments, in the souls of millions who feel disconnected from their work, their lives, and even themselves. Maybe you see it in yourself. Maybe you see it in someone you know. The question is, will you do something about it? Unlike Bartleby, we have a choice. We don't have to silently fade into the background. We can question, challenge, and reshape the way we live before it's too late. But that starts with awareness. That starts with conversations like this. If this video made you think, if you found something in this story that hit close to home, let me know in the comments below. Let's start a discussion. And if you want to support more content like this, hit that like button, subscribe, and share this video with someone who needs to hear it. And if you really want to help the channel grow, consider donating using the super thanks button below. Your support keeps these deep dives coming and helps us explore more of the forgotten stories that reveal so much about who we are. Thank you for watching. Remember, question everything, seek meaning, and most importantly, don't let the world turn you into Bartleby. I'll see you in the next video.